Welcome to the kingdom. I'm Chris, and this is Good Enough Gaming. Welcome back to the channel, and welcome to my second installment of the video series comparing Games Workshop with one-page rules. The first video I put out last week on the cost got a really good reception. I got some great comments both on the agreement side and the disagreement side, and I appreciate both. So last time, as I said, we looked at the monetary cost of the hobby. How much does it cost to get into the hobby, either as a customer of Games Workshop or as one-page rules? And then once you get into the hobby, how much does it cost to stay in the hobby? And as I said, I got some great feedback. There were some folks who disagreed with me, and that's totally fine. These videos aren't meant to be persuasive. I'm not trying to convince you to quit Warhammer and play one-page rules. I'm not a shill for one-page rules. I've just played both. I've enjoyed both, so I wanted to sit back and look and say, okay, which one is better for certain kinds of experiences than the other? So with this video, we're going to be looking at the lore, the world building, and the universe that each of these game systems exists in. Now, I'll just admit my personal bias right from the start. I think Games Workshop wins this one hands down. Again, at least in my opinion. The grim darkness of the far future is one of the most incredible fictional universes I've ever encountered. Part of that, at least for me, is because they have found a way to literally mix everything you could want in a fictional universe together. You have legions of science fiction-like superhuman soldiers, but many of the Space Marine chapters are clearly inspired by the culture or time period in Earth's history. So you're literally having the past and the future welded together. You got the Ultramarines are ancient Rome. You got the White Scars are the Mongol hordes of Genghis Khan. You got the Space Wolves are the Norse Vikings. Others may not be quite as obvious. You've got some splits like the Blood Angels and the Night Lords being very vampiric in nature, but you get the point here. GW has found a way to take whatever area of time, whatever culture, whatever period you're interested in, and found a way for you not only to enjoy it, but to catapult it into the 41st millennium. And who wouldn't want to do that? Along with that great mixing of past and present, they put that into the mechanics of the game. So you have a game where there's laser guns, plasma guns, you have faster than light travel, at the same time as you have melee weapon with swords and axes. The two exist together, and yet neither one seems out of place. And at the same time, we mix in some super old stuff. So while you have the Imperium held together by, like I said, faster than light travel, space transport, teleportation, all that stuff, the government of the Imperium is almost straight up feudalism. You have magic and monsters at the same time as you have futuristic beings from other planets. You have psychic powers. You have all of this stuff. So no matter what you're looking for, it's there, and they've blended it in so it doesn't feel like they threw it in just to have it there. It even touches on some stuff that you might consider high culture, like philosophy and theology. Anyone who has read part of the Horus Heresy series or saw that video on YouTube, The Last Church, that's a great example of what I'm talking about. You have an entire short story in which the Emperor of Mankind and a monk debate the finer points of theology. I mean, how cool is that to have that in a science fiction universe? So the 40K universe has everything in it, and if there's ever something you absolutely need that just doesn't fit, there's always the warp. The warp is always there to provide something off the wall, out of the blue, out of context, or just flat out strange. Either that, or you can always have the story take place on a planet that is set in whatever setting you want. So it can be a desert planet that's not very highly developed, and bam, you've got the Wild West. You can set it in a subterranean city, in one of the hive cities, if you want something really kind of dank and moldy and you know, really kind of creepy like that. As we've seen, the Black Library has started recently releasing crime and horror and other kinds of genres, but all set in the 40K universe. And again, as I've said with all the others, it's not out of place. So now we move on to the second area of Games Workshop lore and world building, and that's their fantasy realm. So what used to be the old world became Age of Sigmar. And Age of Sigmar, again, this is just for me, it wasn't as enticing as the lore of the old world, but I think that's, in my case, due more to nostalgia than necessarily quality. I played Warhammer Fantasy for years before starting playing in 40K. In fact, Warhammer Fantasy was the game that got me into tabletop gaming. If you haven't seen my video on Battle Masters, there'll be a link up to it in the top right there, but that was the game that first introduced me to some kind of tabletop wargaming. And when I finally bought into Warhammer Fantasy proper, I bought into that box set that was Bretonnians and Lizardmen. So that was many a year ago. So after spending lots of time in the Warhammer Fantasy world, and then to hear GW obliterate the old world to make way for the Age of Sigmar, it hurt just a wee bit. Now, not enough to light my models on fire, but it still hurt. And while we're on the subject of fire, we then get to that dumpster fire that was the initial rule set of Age of Sigmar, and that really kicked someone when they were down. So losing the world, GW literally obliterated the old world, and in its place introduced a game that, let's be honest, its first iteration sucked. It was unplayable. So I completely lost interest in GW's fantasy world for a time there. Now, I still maintained a very healthy interest in high fantasy in general. I was a huge fan of the Dragonlance novels, the Wheel of Time, the Lord of the Rings, other fantasy worlds like that. It's just I no longer had this huge desire to be in Games Workshop's fantasy world. So I was really excited when the Total War computer game franchise picked up Warhammer and turned it into, I think, one of my favorite computer games ever. And so that was a way to kind of resurrect the old world. So you could play Age of Sigmar, and they've done a much better job improving both the rules and the lore. I've read some of the novels set in the world, and they're good. They're enjoyable. It didn't pull me in as deeply as 40K or as Horus Heresy, which we'll get to in just a second. But for me personally, I miss the old world. I'm excited that GW is bringing it back. I'm just curious what they're going to do about it lore-wise, because they destroyed it. So they'll have to do the setting then before all of that happened. Alright, so that then brings us to the Horus Heresy. Oh, the Horus Heresy. It's, I don't know if I would call it like a dependent relationship, but the only thing better than getting into a trilogy or a small series is getting into one that hosts over 100 books and short story collections, all set in the same world, with interlocking narratives, all set over a major narrative. I mean, it is, you could get lost in there, and that's both good and bad. Think of your favorite book series and imagine if it just never ended. And think of your favorite book series and imagine if it just never ended. I started reading that novel series before my children were even born. My oldest is about to graduate high school, and they're still not done with it. Now, most of the books were good. A few of them were great, and a couple were, I thought, bad. But in general, it was unusual for me to read a Horus Heresy book and honestly say, boy, I wish I hadn't read that one. In general, I enjoyed it, and I was looking forward to the next one, and occasionally you had one that you could power through in a day or two. They were so good. It was also really nice when I got started because I was a bit late to it, and by the time I found out about the series, they were already about 10 or 12 books in. And so every time I finished one, the next one was already available. I just had to go get it, find a used copy, and go ahead and read through it. But then once I caught up, then we get to the negative side of this dependent relationship, where you're having to wait for them to release the next book in the series. And while you wait for the next one, I'm quite sure the intention was for you to enjoy all of the one-off books and the offshoots and things like that. I imagine that was the entire point, but I mean, I didn't want to spend that much time in the universe, so I mean, it was both good and bad. So for me to illustrate how strong and how rich I think Games Workshop lore and world building is, indulge me in a little bit of story time here. I started an entirely new army, a Chaos Alpha Legion army, after I finished reading the Horus Heresy book Legion, because I enjoyed that book so much. I was really drawn to so many elements of that particular army. The whole ambiguity as to whether or not they were traitor or loyalist, the whole concept of the dual Primarchs that could swap places with each other on a moment's notice, the idea that every member of the Legion was made to look very similar to each of the Primarchs, so you never really knew who was who. All that duplicity made them absolutely fascinating. Their motivation for participating in the Horus Heresy and the Civil War fascinating. I just had to play them. So I had a 40k army, and then when 30k actually started becoming a thing, when they started with the Betrayal at Calthbox, I started an Alpha Legion army with them there. That's how much I like them. And I'll bet just about everybody who plays 40k or 30k has a similar story, and probably even fantasy for that matter. One army, for some reason, spoke to you. And that's what I mean when I say GW has built an incredible world. With one-page rules, I project my own favorites regarding lore into the game. It's not, I don't say that's wrong, but I started playing the Alpha Legion because of the lore. The story of that Legion made me want to play them on the tabletop. Whereas there's nothing like that in one-page rules. I haven't read about the history or lore of one of the factions and said, I gotta play that. Instead, I think of what kind of army I'd like to play and then go to one-page rules and say, okay, that's the one that's closest to it. So with that segue now, let's start talking about one-page rules. Until recently, one-page rules was literally a knockoff or a mimic of 40K. The title of the sci-fi universe in one-page rules is Grim Dark Future. I mean, where do you think they got that idea from? A clear reference to 40K. One-page rules created their own factions based on the factions that were in 40K. And when they initially released the rule set, it was pretty much a one-to-one. If there was an army for it in 40K, one-page rules had a counterpart for it. Each model or unit in that army had some kind of counter in one-page rules, and they made the names as close as possible so that it was easy to find the crossover, but that was the point. The creator of one-page rules wanted to make a game where you could still enjoy the universe and the lore of 40K while having a rule set that was a little bit more balanced, a little faster, a little less cumbersome. The game was meant to be an alternative, and so they wanted to make sure that it offered everything 40K already had. Now, as some have found out, between various editions of Games Workshop games, units and models disappear from codexes, and you're left with that great model that you have, but you can't ever use except maybe as a proxy. The goal of one-page rules was in part then to catch whatever Games Workshop was dropping. So if there was a model that no longer existed in the Games Workshop universe, you could build it over in the one-page rules universe and still feel like you were playing the same models, the same army, and have the same kind of aesthetic and feel for what you were doing. Now, since one-page rules is starting to become a little bigger, a little more well-known, there is a desire for them to start making a little bit of their own lore and not just basically carbon copy Games Workshop. But if we head over to the one-page rules website, they introduce their world in a manner that's super general. You can pause the video if you want to read this whole thing here, but essentially they take the famous statement, the famous line from 40K, in the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. And they managed to say it over 3 paragraphs. The universe is at war, nobody knows why, but everyone's fighting for different reasons. Some races are passive, some are more aggressive, and we have cool technology. And that's about it. So it leaves a lot to be desired. Now, individual army rosters add a little bit more fluff, a little bit more spice, and have some more details to kind of flesh out the individual armies, and some of them even have real proper nouns and stuff. But for the most part, it's very, very generic. Now, it should be noted that the website, in the area where it starts talking about the gameplay, it states very clearly how you want to play the game should be up to you. So by making the narrative very general and bland, nothing is off the table. And maybe the point is they don't want to tie themselves down by a lot of narrative and lore, because then that will interfere with what players can and can't do. We all know that you can make whatever game you want, you can play whatever kind of setup you want, that's fine, but it does feel really weird if you're playing a game with 3 friends and 2v2 teams, and just because of the way things work out, a Space Marine army teams up with Chaos. I mean, it just doesn't fit. So you have that problem with the lore. Games Workshop has canonized a very rich, immense, and full narrative, but that narrative blocks out certain things from ever happening without some serious retconning, or just, you know, like waving the magic wand and suddenly Necron and Blood Angels are BFFs. But, you know, they'd never do something like that. So in general, one-page rules lore, it needs some serious work. Now, they recognize that, and they're starting to do some stuff about it. So they added factions to their games that I'm sure in some cases players would love to see in 40K. So, for example, one-page rules had squats. It had space dwarves for a long time before Games Workshop finally reintroduced the Leagues of Votann. People wanted to play the squats for years, and GW never relented. And so if you headed on over to one-page rules, you could play your squad army. One-page rules also took many of the fantasy armies and gave them sci-fi counterparts. So for example, Lizardmen and Skaven, those exist in the fantasy game, both in Games Workshop and in one-page rules. But if you head over to one-page rules, they have a space version of the rats and of the lizardmen. You don't have that in 40K. Now, granted, there are some sci-fi armies in 40K that aren't reflected in fantasy. They don't want the game to be a carbon copy, whereas one-page rules, they seem to be more along that line. And then next, in addition to porting over some of the armies that GW didn't, or taking ones from fantasy and giving them a sci-fi adaptation, One Page Rules has started to create some completely unique factions, like the Jackals and the Eternal Dynasty. So the Jackals kind of give me like Mad Max vibes. The entire army is supposed to be an army of scroungers and scavengers, and just the aesthetic to them looks like what you'd expect from those Mad Max films. The Eternal Dynasty, on the other hand, is sci-fi Japan. And it really surprises me that Games Workshop hasn't made some kind of Japan-themed army. Now, they might have, you know, successor chapters or something that are built around that. And there might be some units in some armies that have maybe that kind of aesthetic, but there isn't an entire army for space samurai in the way that the Space Wolves are space Vikings. So here, I think this is one area where One Page Rules lore has a bit of a leg up, is that not only do they have this entire faction based on feudal Japan, but because the game is model agnostic, if you can find models that look like beefy samurai and you can kit bash them or print them or somehow find them that look very perfect for Space Marine samurai, you can go ahead and use them. I mean, why not? With a little bit of looking around, you can create the Samarines, and away you go. You find the aesthetic you want, you put it into the game. Whereas Games Workshop, you find the aesthetic that already exists that you like, and then you jump into it. So I still think that GW is going to come across as the overall winner here. But to be fair, One Page Rules is a baby in comparison to how long Games Workshop has been around. So who knows, maybe in a decade or two, they will have developed and refined a world that is as cool as Games Workshop, although that's going to be a very, very difficult order to fill. Now, One Page Rules hosts a OPR writing jam where they have fans take 48 hours. It's a competition to write a story that fits on, you guessed it, one page. And then they submit it, and the winners are actually published on the website. Now, Games Workshop has something very similar where they have, I think it's once a year, they have open submissions. You can submit any manuscript or idea for a story, and if Black Library likes it enough, they will contract you and you can become an author. However, it's going to be a lot more difficult to get into publishing something for the Black Library than something for One Page Rules. So all you aspiring authors out there, I know you would love very much to contribute your own volume to the Horus Heresy, but one, it's almost over, and two, you've got an entire globe worth of competition, a very, very high standard to meet, and you've got to master all that lore to make sure that your story doesn't somehow mess up the timeline or do something that can't happen. Whereas with One Page Rules, they're at the ground floor. So if you can get in on the ground floor, maybe you could help actually shape the very world that they are building. Now, who wouldn't want that? To 20 years from now, be able to tell people, hey, you see what that feature in that game? I came up with that. Or that element of the storyline? Yeah, that was me. So One Page Rules is taking steps to try and stand on its own 2 feet. But because it started as a knockoff, that's very, very difficult. You look at games like War Machine, they're able to develop their own narrative because they didn't try to come out as a copycat or an alternative lore-wise. They create their own worlds, their own heroes, everything. Games Workshop now has to try and convince you that there's something different entirely, when for so long their whole aesthetic was, we are 40K, just not in name or not officially. So let me put it this way. I still have to make a conscious effort to refer to armies and models in the One Page Rules universe by their actual name and not whatever Games Workshop would call them. I have to really think about it to not call the Robot Legions Necrons and not call the Havoc Brothers Chaos. To say this rule, that this unit has the regeneration rule instead of feel no pain. So I imagine that's what it's like to be an actor who got fame and fortune because your parents were famous and you never changed your last name, and so trying to convince others that you actually made it on your own and aren't just riding on mommy and daddy's famous coattails, you know, it's like a nepotism of sorts. So, I mean, some actors have done it. Some have done it better than others. So it's possible that One Page Rules might one day stand on its own, in its own universe, that people don't just look at and say, well, you know, that's 40K light. So in the end here, I gotta say, clear winner on lore and world building is Games Workshop. One-page rules might be able to establish their own given time, given some effort, but it will be an uphill battle and it might take years or maybe even decades. So I hope you enjoyed the video. Please leave your comments or any other tidbits you want to add to it down in the comments section. The next video we'll be looking at the gaming communities of each sides and the benefits and drawbacks of each one. So I hope you enjoyed the video, or that if you didn't thoroughly enjoy it because it wasn't perfect, that at least it was good enough.